So, how is early childhood trauma unique? Of course, we know that trauma can wreak havoc on our nervous systems, on our overall functioning at any age. But what makes it more impactful in early childhood? I think what's notable about the early childhood period is that by age 3, a child's brain has reached about 80% of its adult volume, and neuroplasticity, so kind of the way children are able to make connections to things, that is the strongest during early childhood. And so this is a really critical period of development. I'm sure you hear that term a lot. But in terms of brain development, it's vital that a child has positive experiences, positive relationships, that their needs are being met in early childhood to avoid these more kind of long-term physiological effects on them. And so some of these impacts of early childhood trauma is that especially as compared to maybe an adult experiencing trauma, is that there's this their sensory processing systems can be thrown all out of whack when they experience trauma. So maybe certain visual stimuli can activate a stress response, or maybe loud noises, or if somebody's, just swift movements from another person or touch, those things can be associated with a traumatic experience. So, it can be related to a specific event or even just high stress that a young child has experienced. And even if that trauma is not experienced directly by the child. So for example, if a child has maybe witnessed domestic violence in the home, maybe they were in a different room, or maybe they were not involved in the incident, but the fact that they've heard this experience, that can disrupt their sensory processing experiences long term. And so, children are also less able to anticipate danger or know how to keep themselves safe. And so, one, this may make them more susceptible to trauma. And also, if they have experienced trauma, that certain experiences create certain cognitions in their head of what maybe they think is normal or what expectations are. One example is that young children have kind of a different perception of reality than we do, and due to their immature kind of cognition, and so they might associate that I spilled my milk and then mom and dad got in a fight, that's my fault, and when I make a mistake, these bad things might happen. And so that's just one example of a cognition that we know is distorted to us as adults, but for a young child, that makes sense to them. And so, we want to consider how this kind of sets up their whole way of thinking in other situations. And maybe that might help us understand how a young child is acting in the daycare setting, or maybe is having difficulty making friends, or seems just really shy or antisocial. These are just things to consider, and kind of how trauma might be influencing a child's presentation in other settings. The other thing is that young children can't express how they're feeling, what they need. And so sometimes that might lead to them acting out in different ways to communicate that. And it might not be communicated in an appropriate manner or even an effective manner to get their needs met, but that they're communicating in the way that they can. The other Another way that early childhood trauma is unique is that it impacts the development of the brain. I did have a picture here and I guess it didn't show up, but kind of the picture that I wanted to add in here was, a picture of a 3-year-old's brain that had not experienced trauma and a 3-year-old's brain who had. And the amount of gray matter in each child's brain was very different. And so really what that's saying is that their kind of capacity for functioning, is higher in an individual who has not experienced such trauma. And you can see it in brain scans. It's not just something that we're assuming based on behavior, but something that has been proven through research. And so, some other kind of examples of the ways that trauma can affect the body and physiological systems is it can lead to dysregulation in the HPA axis, which is our body's stress response system. So it can, make it more sensitive, so that individuals might be more prone to acting out and getting really worked up when maybe there's not actually a stress being present. It can also impact the activity of neurotransmitters in the brain. For example, maybe there's decreased serotonin as a result of that, or too much epinephrine or adrenaline that impacts a child's functioning. And early childhood trauma has also been associated with reduced size of the brain cortex, which is responsible for various really significant brain functions like memory, attention, visual processing, sensory processing, speech, motor planning. I'm sure, I don't know if some of those things sound familiar as things that we are assessing for when children come to us. I know for probably me and Megan and doing early childhood assessments, I am almost always looking at speech. I'm almost always assessing some motor skills. Sensory processing is a huge one, and attention. And so, it's very clear that trauma can be really embedded in the way that a whole child is functioning in their environment. And so it's really important, of course, that we're understanding how trauma might show up in early childhood, and how that might impact the way that we're perceiving different behaviors or developmental concerns. And then lastly, this is not an exhaustive list, but lastly on this slide, children are dependent on their parents and their caregivers to keep them safe, to help them regulate. We know that children need co-regulation to be able to learn how to regulate their own bodies. And this goes back to that quote that I just recently shared, that there's no such thing as an infant. There's always somebody else. An infant and a baby, a child needs somebody else to help them process these big emotions, big events. And so, this leaves us with, instead of asking, what's wrong with this child, I encourage you to shift your thinking to what happened to this child.